Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Hope everyone's having a good NDC so far. Anybody feeling a little bit full of information at this point in the conference? All right. Well, I appreciate you still being here. Hopefully, there'll be something really useful for you in this talk. Show of hands, who's a .NET developer in the room? Okay, great. We're going to be talking a lot about .NET today, specifically about what to do with a legacy ASP.NET application that maybe is too big to migrate quickly. So we're going to be talking about a strategy that you can use and some tooling that you can use from Microsoft to do that incrementally. A lot of my clients at my consulting company, Trailhead, come to us with this exact problem. I'm guessing a lot of you probably have these legacy applications. .NET's been around since around 2000, 2001. A lot of applications have been built with it in those 24 years or so. And a lot of those early applications are still around. Who's still maintaining a web forms application and is willing to admit it? All right. So I know those exist out there. And what do you do to move forward? You probably have spent many years creating the functionality that's in that application. And it's not going to happen overnight for you to get from this rusty old car somewhere out here in the outback to this Lamborghini overnight. You're going to have to do that over time because it took you time to get where you are now. So how do you go about doing that? That's what we're going to talk about today. An agenda for what I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about some different approaches that you may have seen for how to do a migration. Then I want to talk about what a reverse proxy is, because that's going to be one of the solutions that we're going to talk about today, using a reverse proxy to be able to make this migration process more incremental. The specific reverse proxy we're going to talk about today is called YARP, Yet Another Reverse Proxy, which is a great acronym, great name. And we're also going to talk about some other tooling from Microsoft that's called the .NET Upgrade Assistant, and how you can use that to do a .NET migration. We're going to actually do a migration live here together so that you can see the steps and you can see what the tooling looks like. You can see the easy parts and the hard parts and what reality will really be like when you try and migrate your application. And finally, I want to tell you a little bit about some other tooling. We won't have a lot of time to go into the details of, but I want to at least mention it to you so you're aware of something called System.Web adapters. That's an important tool. But before we get into all of those great details, just a quick introduction of who I am. My name is Jonathan Tower. I go by Jay for short. So I know if any of you are Aussies, I know you like to shorten words. So hopefully that makes sense to you, calling me Jay. But if we get a chance to chat afterwards, feel free to call me that. You can also reach out to me online at any of these places. And a unique offering I like to give to anybody that comes to one of my talks. If you have a question that is a burning question you'd really like to ask, maybe you need to show some of the existing system, or maybe you're a little embarrassed to ask the question in front of everyone else, even though probably a lot of other people have the same problems that you're facing at work. But if you want to take advantage of this, you can contact me using this QR code or that bit.ly link there and get a free consultation, just a chance to chat, obviously at an opportune time for both of us, depending on what time zones we're in. But a time to chat and ask those questions and go into a little bit more detail if you'd like to do that. Finally, on this slide, I saw some of you taking pictures already. This GitHub link at the bottom is where you can find all the code that we'll look at today, as well as the slides that I'm showing you right now. All right, so let's jump into it. Before we get into all the nitty-gritty details, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about this. .NET Core and .NET, modern .NET have been around for quite a few years now, 7 or 8 years. So I sort of assume that all .NET developers know this, but I realize a lot of us are heads down in our organizations. Maybe you've learned a bunch of new stuff that's been going on for a few years in .NET today and the last couple days, and you haven't had a chance to stay up on things. So just to make sure we're all using the same terminology and you know what I'm talking about today, I wanted to show you this .NET framework. This is the old Windows-only .NET that's been around since 2000, 2001, and really just ends with 4.8. That's the last major version. If you didn't know that already, that's the last major version of .NET Framework that's going to be coming out. There will be support for it for a very long time, security patches and so on, but nothing new is happening in .NET Framework. Around about 2015, .NET Core split off, and that's when the Microsoft .NET team went and basically said it's time to modernize .NET, and they went and rewrote it from scratch. It's cross-platform. Performance is a key indicator. And then right about between version 3 and version 5 of .NET Core is where the rebranding happened. That is maybe where a lot of us got confused. And that's where they basically said, look, if .NET Framework is done, then there really is only one .NET going forward, and that's what we're currently calling .NET Core. And that's what Microsoft said. There's this marketing campaign they said is there's only one .NET. You might have seen that announced at a build a few years ago. So one .NET, now we just basically call .NET Core .NET. Sometimes to clarify, I'll talk about .NET Framework versus modern .NET. But what I'm talking about is basically .NET Core or this modern version of .NET. Further confusing things, though, is that ASP.NET, what we use to build web applications on top of .NET for the last 20-some years, has a kind of a different relationship with the word core. So .NET has dropped the word core, but ASP.NET Core has not. We, of course, all know about the legacy version of ASP.NET. That is built on .NET Framework. That's probably what a lot of you are here hoping that you'll learn an easier way to migrate away from at some point. Then when .NET Core came out, ASP.NET Core came out at the same time, the first several versions of that, you could actually compile against .NET Framework or against .NET Core. Now, ASP.NET Core, all the modern versions of that since version 3 have only been able to run on .NET, or what was called .NET Core at the time. So clear as mud, hopefully. All right, everybody on the same page. So let's talk about migrating a project and how you might go about doing that. There's a million ways to do it. These are some of the popular options that I've seen. You've probably seen some of these in some of your jobs in the past. There's the Big Bang method, the evolutionary method, and then the Strangler Fig method. So I want to talk about each of these. The Big Bang method, you know you're doing the Big Bang method at your job if you've been locked in the conference room with your team and you're not allowed to come out until something is done. That's usually a Big Bang migration. Sometimes they'll slide pizza under the door, or do Australian developers drink Mountain Dew like American developers do? No? Okay. Can't get it here? No, okay. Too much caffeine, right? None in the Mountain Dew? Oh, that's not even really Mountain Dew then. This is not a very agile approach, right? This is a very waterfall approach. If you just spent 5 to 10 to 15 years developing a legacy application, you're not going to finish migrating it locked in a conference room over the weekend. In fact, there's a word for that. It's called kidnapping. And it's not a really great approach, and it's obviously not a very agile approach either. The evolutionary approach, this is one you may have seen before. This is where you sort of refactor things to move in a direction. This direction in this case might be to move to a modern framework like .NET Core. And as you're moving to that, you might make things a bit worse. You might make performance a bit worse. You might make maintenance a bit worse, and then you'll refactor that. And so it's kind of an up and down pattern where you move towards the goal, makes things worse, you refactor to make things better, then you move another step towards the goal, and so on. This is a great approach, and this can be very agile. However, it doesn't solve a lot of problems, like how do you do releases during the migration process, right? How do you take a half-migrated project that maybe doesn't have good performance right now because of some of the migration steps that you've done and some that you haven't yet? How do you actually release that into production so that you're not essentially doing a huge waterfall project that releases just at the end of the process? So that's definitely a downside to this approach. The other one, and I love giving this talk in Australia because you're probably all familiar with this type of tree, whereas when I give this talk in the US, where I'm from, this is more of a foreign concept to people. I have to explain what a strangler fig is. But you might have heard of this approach. It's a popular architectural approach for migration projects. Basically comes from this plant that you have a lot of here. It's a category of plant that starts growing up in the branches of a tree, and it'll live quite fine up there for a while, and eventually will reach some branches or roots down the tree, wraps them around the host tree's roots, eventually kills that host tree, and then basically forms like a hollow core of a new tree around the original host tree. A bit of a slow motion, violent analogy, but I think it's a very apt analogy for this Strangler Fig approach to doing a migration, which seems less violent when I put it in boxes. So here's some boxes version of that architectural diagram. So imagine you start with an application that has a lot of endpoints, a lot of functionality in the legacy. You create a new modern application as maybe a placeholder. It's empty at first. And you put a facade layer in front of that. What's the facade layer there for? Well, that's basically to make the client, whether that's an end user or whether that's an API consumer or whatever your client is, it's to make them none the wiser about what's going on behind the scenes. So you can actually make everything look and work the same way that it has all along, but you're actually moving things over into a modern application. Gradually over time, you get to step 2. You've moved more things into the modern application. And all this time, you can be pushing these things out into production because of that facade layer that's bringing everything together, that makes it look and feel like the same application it's always been. And then eventually, you've moved everything over into the modern app, and you could potentially get rid of that facade layer at that point, and you're done with your migration. So as you can see, this is a much more incremental approach, and it solves a lot of those problems that the other approaches we just talked about have. So let's talk about reverse proxies now, because that's the approach. Now this is the technology that we're going to use to do this approach. Has anybody used a reverse proxy already? All right, anybody, keep your hands up if you're using YARP already a little bit. Okay, a few of us, great. So for the rest of us that maybe are a little less familiar with a reverse proxy, let's talk about what that is. If anyone's as old as me in the room, they might remember proxy servers or forward proxy servers. This is when there was one computer on a network that actually had internet access. I know I sound old saying that. It doesn't even sound real to the younger folks in the room, but yes, believe it or not, at one point in the internet, there would be a whole local area network and only one computer would be granted access. And if you wanted to grant access, what you had to do was basically set that computer that was kind of on the edge of the network facing the internet as a proxy server, and your computer would make requests to that, which would then proxy those requests out to wherever on the internet and bring the results back to you. Multiple people could use the same proxy server, and that's basically what you see going on in this diagram here. Clients connecting out into the internet through a proxy server out to whatever servers on the internet. That's a forward or a regular proxy. A reverse proxy is just taking those two things and swapping them around. So now instead of the clients coming through the proxy server to go out to the internet, they're coming in from the internet and they're hitting the proxy server first before they hit the servers. So if you've ever used a load balancer before or a firewall before, that's really, in a way, acting as a proxy server for you, a reverse proxy server for you in that application. So in that case, traffic comes into the internet, it hits that reverse proxy first, and goes then into the correct internal server. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a proxy server. If you've never used one before, if you're one that didn't raise your hand that you've been using one, you might be wondering, what would I use a proxy server for? Well, there's a bunch of different things you could use them for. Security is definitely one of them. Load balancing is another one. If you've ever used a load balancer, it's essentially a reverse proxy that has one job, which is balancing traffic between multiple servers. Another one that's less well known is A/B testing. What if you want to put 10% or 20% of your users on a new feature and have the other 80% that are still using the old one and find out whether people like it better, is it performing better before you put 100% of your users on it? Another one is URL rewriting or using it for a microservice API gateway. That's a common use of them these days. Another one that I find really useful is feature flags. If you want to turn on a feature, and if things go well, you leave it on, and if things don't go well, you can turn it back off. That's something that you could do with a reverse proxy very easily as well. And then the last one I've got on this side here is the one that we're mostly focused on today, which is doing incremental migrations. Okay, so we've talked about the approach. We've talked about how a reverse proxy server can fill the role of that facade layer and what a reverse proxy is a little bit. Let's talk now about YARP specifically. So how does YARP work? So if you imagine that diagram we were looking at before, basically you need to have something that receives the request first. That would be the facade layer. And in this case, YARP is actually going to be hosted right inside of your modern application, so your ASP.NET Core application. If you haven't started your migration yet, this will be something that you would create first. If you've started your migration already, maybe you already have this, and you just add YARP as a NuGet package. So it's very simple. Do maybe 1 to 5 lines of configuration code, and you're up and running. So traffic coming in from clients might hit the request response pipeline, the middleware pipeline that is in ASP.NET Core. And YARP actually goes very high in that pipeline. And so it'll hit YARP before it hits MVC or your APIs. And that's where something called the routing table comes into play. You may or may not be totally aware that ASP.NET has something called a routing table. But basically any route that you create with a controller, or all the different technology, Razor views and web forms, all of these things historically over the years create the same thing behind the scenes, which is basically here's all the routes that I can respond to. All of those things are registered in kind of an in-memory database, if you will. And that routing table then knows what endpoints it can respond to and which ones it should just do a 404. So it's going to look at that routing table and say, do I have this endpoint that's being requested, registered? And if the answer is yes, then it's going to go ahead and forward that down the pipeline. And eventually that's going to hit MVC, which is going to say, oh, I have a controller for that. It's going to forward it to your controller code. Or if you're doing minimal APIs, to your minimal API endpoint. Whatever technology you're using, it's going to forward that to your code that you've written to handle that particular endpoint. What happens if that request comes in and there is no route for that request in the route table? Well, then it's not going to keep going down the pipeline. The YARP middleware is actually going to forward that or proxy it through to the legacy application that you've configured. In this case, to our ASP.NET legacy application. And that's going to do whatever it does to that response. It's going to respond to that and handle that with whatever code that's written in there, and then send the response all the way back through YARP, back to your client. So that's kind of how YARP works as a reverse proxy. So if you go back to that architectural diagram that I had where there's 3 boxes, there's the facade layer, the modern app, and the legacy app, right? Well, we only talked about 2 boxes on that last slide. So how does that work? Well, when you're doing YARP, one of the benefits is that the modern application, or the ASP.NET Core application, actually hosts YARP inside of it. And so YARP there is your facade layer running inside of your modern app. MVC or whatever, minimal API or whatever you're using in your modern app to respond to the requests is your modern app, and ASP.NET or whatever you're using for your legacy app is your legacy app. So you can actually see there's really only 2 boxes here, which means there's only 2 things to deploy instead of 3 things to deploy, which is kind of nice. All right. So for those that raised their hands before that were using a proxy, but not maybe using YARP yet, you might be thinking like, okay, we've already got a proxy. Why would I care about YARP? You're maybe using one of these pretty popular proxies that are out there, reverse proxies. So why would you use YARP? Well, number one, it's been written from the ground up with performance in mind. I know about 10 years ago, that wasn't something we could as easily say about .NET. But now I think hopefully everyone that's doing .NET is very convinced that that is very important at Microsoft. So performance, it's extremely easy to use. I mentioned it's just a NuGet package with 1 to a few lines of code that you're going to write to configure it. It's extensible and configurable if you want to do all kinds of different scenarios. A lot of stuff is built in to do that, and you can do it just through configuration. But you can also totally customize it with your own C# and .NET code to make it do whatever scenario you want. If you've got some weird thing where there's some custom header that comes in, and if that comes in, it needs to be handled by one server, and some other header value gets forwarded to another server, you can write any of that logic you want, and you can use YARP to do that logic for you. Then the last thing is, when you are doing this type of a Strangler Fig pattern for a legacy migration, you have 3 applications to deploy and configure all the time. You've got your facade layer, you've got your modern and your legacy app, and this really cuts it down to 2, which I think is great. That's a like 50% reduction. Okay, So let's talk a little bit about something called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. So the .NET Upgrade Assistant is something I'm going to show you in just a minute here to actually do an upgrade. This is something that's built into Visual Studio as an extension, and it's now also an extension for the .NET CLI. So if you're a command line interface person, you can do all of the stuff that you're going to see today at the command line as well. But if you find the GUI to be a little more discoverable or easier to use, no problem. This extension works the same there. Both of them are first-class citizens and have all the same functionality. It supports all kinds of different migrations. We're obviously going to be focused on mostly ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core today. But if you've got WinForms that you want to upgrade to run on .NET, or if you have WPF applications, or if you have Xamarin that you want to upgrade to .NET MAUI, the list goes on. And that even includes, in recent months, there's a project called Core WCF, which is an open source WCF replacement. Anybody use WCF? Okay, I'm sorry. But if you are using WCF and you're wondering, like, how are we going to get our WCF code to move on to something more modern, there is a open source library called Core WCF, and Microsoft actually supports that now in the .NET Upgrade Assistant as well to migrate your legacy WCF projects. So lots of great stuff supported there. And I forgot to mention class libraries. That's obviously a critical one for even a web application. You're probably going to have some of your own class libraries that you want to migrate as well. All right, so let's actually get into this demo now. Okay, so I have an application here which has two projects in it. This one up here is called eShop Legacy Utilities, and this one is called eShop Legacy MVC. So obviously one of these is a class library and the other one is an MVC project. Anybody seen the eShop samples before from the old days? A little bit, okay. So you might recognize some of this. I literally just took Microsoft's old examples of MVC code because I wanted to show what it would be like if you have an old application running on .NET Framework. So I took a real one that had been developed as a demo application, and we're going to actually start upgrading that, and you can see that process. So if I right-click on this and go to the project properties, you can see this one's actually on .NET 4.7.2. So it's not even on the most modern version of .NET Framework. And that just so happens to be the version that was available when I found it on GitHub. And if we look at our class library here, you can see this one's on 4.6.1, so it's even a little bit older. All right. The other thing I want you to see is if we actually look at our class library, you can see it's doing something that if you've been doing .NET Core or modern .NET development for very long, especially ASP.NET Core, you probably see a red flag here for migration right away. For those that aren't familiar already with that, the red flag that the others are seeing here is that we're using the HTTP context. And where is HTTP context defined? Well, it's defined in System.Web. And guess what doesn't exist in ASP.NET Core? All of System.Web. Okay, so anything you might be using that is like request, response, HTTP context, session, all of those things, they don't exist in modern ASP.NET Core projects. So how are you going to, if you have a class library like this that's expecting that to exist, how are you going to migrate that? Well, that's a common enough problem that Microsoft has an answer to that we're going to look at in just a second here. But I want you to be aware of that. And then let's see. The last thing I want you to see before we actually run this is that I created my own controller that I've added to this project. And you can see, if I zoom this in just a little more for you, you can see here that this is using that class library that we just looked at that has a dependency on System.Web to basically get the user agent for the current browser and set that into a viewbag setting property. And then if we look at the view for this down here, under System.Web, you can see that we've just got a very simple page that is showing that viewbag.userAgent. So just some code here that's relying on System.Web so that we can actually see what's going to happen in your code that relies on System.Web when you try and migrate it. Okay, let's go ahead and run this so you can see what this looks like while we're waiting for this to start up. Any questions so far about anything? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is it just a dumb proxy? And the answer is yes and no. So you can share whatever you can share through HTTP. Obviously, that's how proxies work. But there are some other tools, which we'll talk about towards the end, that allow you to do a little bit more smart, behind the scenes data sharing. So things like session state that I just mentioned, configuration, authorization, authentication, all of those types of things that are cross-cutting concerns between the two applications. There are some things that are built in that are available for you for that. So hang tight and we'll answer that at the end. All right, perfect killing time there while we waited for the project to start up and queuing up a topic for later. I appreciate that. But you can see the application is now running here. It's nothing fancy. It's not going to win any design awards, but it works. I can come in here and I can edit my stock or change the description or whatever I want to on these different products that are in the shop. All right, so that's my legacy application. Let's look at how we would actually upgrade this. Any guesses between these two projects? What would be the right place to start migrating between these two options, class library and MVC? Shout it out if you have the answer. I hear some murmuring of class libraries, and yes, that is correct. And that's, of course, just based on dependencies, right? Everything else is going to be dependent on the class libraries, so I'm going to want to start with the class libraries first. Now, you may or may not be familiar with something called .NET Standard. We're going to look at that in just a second here, but before we start, I just do want to show you the fact that I have an extension installed called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. So if you come in here to Visual Studio and go to Tools Extensions and search online for .NET Upgrade Assistant, you can make sure you have this installed in your Visual Studio as well. There's also a command line tool that you can use from the .NET CLI that has the same name that you can use there to do all the same things you're going to see today in Visual Studio. Okay, so those that said starting with the class library are correct. Once I install that extension, you'll actually notice something you probably don't have in your right-click menu if you haven't installed it yet, which is this upgrade option. So if I pick that, I get a new tab in my IDE, and it shows me a couple of different options for a class library. Do I want to upgrade to a new version of .NET, or do I want to upgrade project features? Well, I want to upgrade it to a new version of .NET. That's kind of the point here. So I get a few different ways I can go about doing it. Do I want to do it side-by-side, incremental project upgrade? That means maybe this is going to be time-consuming, and I want to have both available at the same time. Another one is just a side-by-side upgrade, so it's going to basically copy this into another project for me. Now, I know there's only a few lines of code in this class library, so I suspect it's not going to be a terrible migration process. So I'm going to just go ahead and be brave and do the in-place migration. I'm using Git anyway. I can always roll this back if I need to. But I'm going to be brave and do that in-place migration. So I pick Next. And I get a bunch of different options of what I want to target. So I could just target .NET 8 because that's the newest long-term support version of .NET that's out right now. But I actually want this to work both for .NET Framework and for .NET Core applications. I might have a little bit of time where this class library needs to be able to be called by my .NET Framework legacy app and by my .NET modern app. And so .NET Standard is this thing I referred to earlier. It sounds like it's some other type of .NET, like all the different .NETs that used to be out there, .NET Mini, .NET for Micro, all of those things that you might have heard of. This is not that. It is actually a standard, as the name suggests, that different flavors of .NET can actually apply to. And so if I pick .NET Standard, what I'm actually saying is that I want to support a certain subset of .NET frameworks and a certain subset of .NET cores and modern .NETs. And you can actually go online, and if you just search for .NET Standard versions like that, you will get to some nice documentation that shows you how that actually applies to different versions. So we picked 2.0, and that shows me that I'm basically .NET Framework 4.6 and above, and I'm .NET Core 2 and all the way up to modern .NET 8. Okay, so that's basically what I'm saying by saying .NET Standard is I'm saying I want to support all of those, plus all those other ones that were listed there are supported as well. Okay, so I'll pick .NET Standard, and now I get this page that kind of tells me, hey, here's all the code files and dependencies and things that are in your project. Do you want to check or uncheck any of them? If you know some of them are going to be problematic, you could uncheck them at this point. I'm going to do everything. And now I get a progress window that shows me both a progress bar and shows me kind of check boxes appearing next to things as they complete. And you can see it's taken about 11 seconds, and all 14 of the steps that it was migrating were successful. So if I go back in here and look at the code, you can see that the code looks pretty much the same as it did before in my class library. But if I go to the properties of this, you can see it's now targeting .NET Standard 2.0 instead of .NET 4.6.1 that it was targeting before. The other thing I want to point out is if we actually go look at the project file, you might know this already, but the project files are a very different format between .NET Framework and modern .NET. And as you can see here, this has been upgraded for me. You can also see that I don't have a NuGet file as a separate file like you used to for .NET Framework projects. It's actually all been moved here. All my NuGet packages have been moved here into my project file. And then the last thing I want to call out here is this Microsoft.ASP.NET Core System.Web adapters. This is going to be very important because this is actually going to make all of my System.Web code work in my application. If I go back here, in fact, if I clicked and to go to the definition of this before, where would it have said this was coming from? Anybody know? System.web.dll is where the definition of HTTP context would have been before. It's small text up here, but can you see where that's actually coming from now in my class library? It's coming from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core.System.Web adapters NuGet package. So all things that reference that System.Web namespace have now been redirected to that NuGet package. The migration tool actually recognized the fact that I was using System.Web in my code and automatically applied that NuGet package for me and added it to the project. And it just made everything kind of magically work. So if I even come here and now rebuild this project, you'll see that everything rebuilds successfully. So I've now kind of migrated that class library. Everything's also totally fine because it's .NET Standard, and my .NET 4.7 web application is still referencing this, but now it's .NET Standard instead of being .NET 4.6.1. That's fine because .NET Standard can be referenced by both .NET Framework and .NET Core, so no problem there. So I'm good to go. Basically, I've got that done. Now the hard part is the web application. Anybody who's learned ASP.NET for a long time and then tried to learn ASP.NET Core knows that there are quite a few differences between the two. If you look at a controller file, it's going to look pretty much exactly the same. But if you look at the startup code, or if you look at configuration or something like that, it's going to be quite different. The project file is going to be quite different. So there are some pretty heavy differences between the two, which is why this is such a time-consuming process, right? It's not just an automatic upgrade, change a few things here and there, and you're just magically working. It's a little bit of a lift. And then obviously, if you're using something like web forms, which doesn't exist in .NET Core, then you have to do much heavier lift because now you're rewriting stuff into something more modern. So I'm going to click here on my web project and pick Upgrade again. I get the list of options again. I'm going to say I want to upgrade this to a newer version of .NET. You'll notice I get fewer options here. In fact, I get one option, which is to just do a side-by-side incremental project upgrade. Incremental, that's that word we had in the title today. That's kind of the magic word here. I'm not going to, if this is a big project, I'm not going to be able to do this in a weekend. I'm going to have to do this over maybe months or years. And so this is going to actually do a side-by-side upgrade. It's going to set up YARP for me. In fact, if you read the description, it says it places ASP.NET Core app in front and falls back to an ASP.NET app via YARP proxy for routes not handled by the new application. So just exactly what we looked at in those diagrams a few minutes ago. It's going to basically set all of that up for me with this legacy application. So if I go ahead and pick next here, I do get the option to pick an existing project. Maybe you've already started creating the modern app and you just want to have it plug YARP into that. In my case, I don't have anything, so I'm going to go ahead and just do a new project. And it gives it a name automatically, but I'm going to change the word legacy here to core instead. And it gives me a few options about which project template I want to use. I'm going to use the default. And then I get to pick a version of .NET. Now, this is a web application, so you'll notice .NET Standard is not here. .NET Standard only applies to class libraries that can be shared across different implementations. But here, this is actually going to be, an application level code, and so it has to be running against an actual framework. So we have to pick which one. I'm going to pick the newest long-term support of .NET version, which is .NET 8. So I pick that. It gives me a little bit of a preview here of what it's about to do. And when I click finish, I'm going to get a similar screen that shows me progress. You see the output window popping up occasionally as things are logging to that as well. And you can see this project only took 7 seconds and went through all 6 stages, and all of them succeeded. So we're pretty excited about that. Now you can tell your boss you're done, right? Not exactly. If we look here in the Solution Explorer, you see there's a new project. It's called eShop Core MVC, which is what I asked for it to be named. And if we look at the project properties, you can see it is targeting .NET 8. But we also, if we look inside of it, we'll see that it's pretty light inside of here. There's a program CS file, and that's about it. So not really much going on here, but what I do want to show you is that we're very close to having this actually working anyway. So let me go ahead and build the solution this way, just see if we get any errors, because we will get a few. And I'll show you how to handle those. Okay, yep. Sorry, I haven't actually done the step that'll give me errors yet. So let me actually just show you a couple configuration things, and then I will show you that we actually have this working. Okay, so if you'll notice here in my modern application, there is a map forwarder right here, app.mapForwarder, and it's got this kind of funny looking route being defined that says catch-all. This is a hard-coded route that you can define that basically says, I want YARP to handle all potential incoming requests. I could filter that down to say just things under a certain directory, API / or whatever particular path or pattern you want it to. But I want it to actually look at everything. I want it to compare that to my route table, like we saw in the diagram. And if it can't find it in the route table, then to forward it. So I'm just going to basically leave it this way and say, compare everything to the route table. Go ahead and catch any request. And then the second thing I want you to notice here is that there's a configuration setting called proxy2 that's being inserted here as a parameter. And that is actually the endpoint that I want it to proxy to should it fail. Should it fail to find the route in question in the route table for the current app. Now, where that's actually defined right now is in my launch settings for debugging purposes. You could set this in an app settings file. You could hard code this. Please don't do that. Better yet, you could actually code this into your CI/CD pipelines to be injected into your code as it's being deployed. That's probably the best way to do it. You could put it in some sort of a configuration store like in Azure. All of those work totally. This is just sort of the debug environment way to do it. So you can see that no matter how I'm launching this, it's going to use localhost 52.429, and it's going to host the modern application on localhost 7066. Okay, so those are kind of the two things to keep in mind. If it's the 4-digit port, then we're actually looking at the modern application. And if it's the 5-digit port that starts with a 5, then we're looking at the legacy application. So I'll go ahead and start this now. We really haven't done any of the migration work except for setting up the proxy at this point. But you'll notice, go ahead and close that. You'll notice here when it finishes compiling and launches, first of all, that I'm on 7066. So this is my modern application that I'm hitting right now. Okay, it's taking a couple seconds longer because it's actually launching and compiling 2 web applications, the modern and the legacy. And you'll notice that my joke about now telling your boss that you're done is still wrong, but it kind of looks like you're done in a way because you're hitting the modern application and everything looks like it's working correctly. If I go edit things, it looks the same way that it did before. Why is it looking like it's done, but it's not done? Well, because it's literally proxying 100% of the requests through. So in a way, what you've done is you've slightly slowed down your legacy application. So maybe you're not done here. Maybe you don't want to actually launch this. You could launch this and it would work just fine. Probably most people wouldn't notice because YARP is so fast. It's not going to be a huge impact. It's not something a human would notice. But obviously, we haven't actually finished anything useful yet. So let's look at doing something useful. So what I want to do is go into my legacy code, and I want to go to that System.Web controller that was using my class library that in turn was using System.Web to get the user agent. So I could right click on this and say I want to upgrade this controller, or I want you to see here, I can also just click on the project at any time and say upgrade. And I kind of like to do it at the project level, and it's because it actually gives me this dashboard that shows me how my progress is going so far. You can see on the right-hand side of this dashboard that I have 100% of my endpoints right now. 15 of them are in .NET Framework, and 0% of them are in .NET. So this might make it harder to argue to your boss that you're done, since it says 0% right there. But it does give you kind of an idea of how you're progressing on this process. And what's really cool about this is this works all throughout the process. It could take you months or years, and you can keep coming back to this dashboard and seeing how many endpoints are in each of the applications. Now, when I click on upgrade controller here, it's going to give me a list of my controllers. I'm going to pick the System.Web controller and say I want to upgrade it. Similar to before, it's going to give me a list of things that I can check or uncheck. I want it to go ahead and do everything related to that controller. So it's actually going to do quite a bit of things here. It's going to do some of the dependencies. It's going to move some views over into my application, right? Because System.Web had a view, but that view was also using a layout view. And so that also has a dependency that has to be moved over, and then the controller itself has to be moved over. Now, this is where I'll tell you that when it comes to something as complex as a web application in ASP.NET, it doesn't get 100% of things correct, and you're about to see one of those things. So if I go into my new application, and the System.Web controller now exists here, you can see the views folder now exists with a whole bunch of things migrated into that as well. We'll look at that in just a minute, but let's go look at the controller. Does anyone remember how this line of code looked before? It was setting a viewBag property equal to the result of that someClass.getHeader and then passing the HTTP context in. It added a bit of stuff here that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll tell you right now that it's still a development in progress, and so it's not perfect all the time. It totally misinterpreted this code, and this is actually what it should have written. So now if I do like that, now I've almost got this line of code fixed. You'll notice here and here, I still have some red squigglies that tell me that there's some sort of a problem with that eShop legacy.utilities class. And it's quite simple. What's happened is I moved that to a .NET Standard class library, which means it could be referenced by .NET Core, or .NET Framework now. But I then created a brand new ASP.NET Core application, and I never referenced it from there. So that's all that's missing here. If I go up to my modern app, and under dependencies here, I'll just say I want to add a project reference, and I'll click the utilities. And now you can see that's working as expected. So let's go ahead and just make sure that this builds. And assuming it's going to work, there's a couple of things wrong. So what's wrong? Well, it doesn't know what to do with some of these things that are from .NET Framework legacy syntax. Now, we could go through the process of fixing these. I don't think it would be very interesting to do that, so I'm just going to comment these out for now. All it's really doing is putting a machine name in the footer, and maybe that's not important to me, or I want to solve that later. This is an incremental process after all. So I'll go ahead and comment that out. And I'll go look at my error list and see that, okay, that seems to have solved that. So let's go ahead and rebuild again, and we'll see if we got everything working. This time everything works. So let's go ahead and run it again. This time we'll go to that System.Web endpoint. While we're doing that though, while we're waiting for that to come up, I want to actually grab this URL for the legacy application as well, so that we can go to both in the browser and see how they look. So the browser popped up behind here. So here it's loading 7066, which is my modern app. I'm going to open a new tab and paste in the URL for the legacy app as well. Okay, so I can see here my legacy app is working as it was before. If I go to /System.Web, which is that controller I wrote, you can see the user agent is being written out, and it's like all nice inside of the page layout. If I go to my modern app, you can see the landing page still looks great. But if I go to System.Web, I get the content of the page, but it looks a little goofy. All right. So what's happening here? Maybe you saw it. I purposely didn't show you the screen for very long, but maybe you saw in the code, if you're a quick reader, that there's something missing in here. You notice this or this when I was on the screen for just a few seconds. Well, that's our problem, right? We've moved this whole controller and its views, and therefore its layout view, into this modern application. But guess what? ASP.NET Core does not include the same bundling library that's available in ASP.NET. Why? Well, basically because there are a million different ways that you can bundle resources in JavaScript and other web technologies now. Web Optimizer and all kinds of other things that exist out there for doing this that you've maybe used before. And Microsoft, I think, rightfully decided that for this front-end code bundling stuff, it does not make sense to reinvent the wheel. That stuff exists. So we're going to let you just use that modern stuff. Now, that's kind of a pain for us because we have this legacy code that we actually want to migrate with as little work as possible. I might be okay with the bundling actually working the way that it did before and not using something more modern like Gulp or Grunt or Web Optimizer. Great news, there is a library that solves that problem for you. And of all things, it's called LigerShark. So let's actually bring LigerShark here into this project so that we can actually use it the same way that we were using it before in our legacy code. So if I come in to NuGet here, and I'll just search for LigerShark. Here you see LigerShark.weboptimizer.core. I'm going to add that to my modern application, and I'll install the latest version right there. So I have to accept all the user license agreements and so on, and then it installs it there. Okay. The next step is, now before I actually configure LigerShark and actually do the bundling in here, I want to show you another intermediate stage that you could do. I'm just going to copy some code here that I have pre-written so that I don't make you watch me just type through our precious time together today. Okay, so I'm going to put in a couple of things here, some CSS up here, and I'm going to put in some scripts down here, right where we had these scripts before. Okay, so I've replaced those. Now I haven't done anything with LigerShark yet to configure bundles to run in the modern application. Any guesses in the room as to what might happen here? What's that? Same as before, that's a good guess. So you think maybe we'll see that System.Web page and it will still look kind of funny without the CSS? Any other guesses? Nobody brave enough to guess a different guess than that? Yeah, there's one guess out there, just let that guy be wrong, right? Okay. All right, so you were maybe half right and half wrong with that guess. So I'll give you 50%. But it actually looks normal. Anybody know why does it look normal here on the modern application? I haven't done anything to bundle those in the modern application. It's using the proxy to forward those now to the legacy application. Yep. So those bundles still exist in the legacy application. I could just be lazy and say, I don't want to do that migration today. It's going to be a little bit too much work. And so there, now I've solved it by just forwarding them through. Okay? That's one way to do it. A better way to do it might be to actually migrate those through. And so what I'm going to do, I've got a few steps to do this. And then we'll try and have some time for some questions at the end. All of the code that I want to bundle is coming from either the content folder here or from the scripts folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy these into my modern app. A bunch of CSS and JavaScript files in these folders. You'll notice my project file just became an absolute disaster with all of those things pasted in, right? So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to just remove those. And there's a much simpler way to write this, which if you're up on your XML of project files, you might have seen this before, where you can do wildcards in there. And so I can basically say anything that's under the content folder, that's anything.anything, any number of levels below. I want you to go ahead and copy that to the output folder. And whoops, I missed. I know some eagle-eyed person noticed that I missed that, and they were like, should I say something? Okay, so I've gone ahead and got all of the XML in there now. And that's a little prettier. Thank you. So this is going to be a little prettier now when I go back and edit anything in the content folder or the scripts folder. That's not going to keep editing that over and over in the project file. And I can have a much simpler project file. Now, the last step I have to do is actually set up the bundles. You've seen this before in the legacy code, where usually in the app start, there'll be a bundle config, and it'll basically say, here's the bundles collection passed into you, and you'll say bundles.add, a script bundle, or a style bundle. The LigerShark syntax is very similar. It's not exactly the same. And so I've also pre-written that so we can just copy that in here. And this actually will happen in startup. There is no bundle config to speak of. So I'm just going to copy this in. And I'm going to go to my modern application and over to my program CS. And right up here where builder is defined, I'm just going to paste in that code. So you can see it's, if I format that, you can see that it is, oh, I missed some code again. There we go. Now it should format a little better. So you can see it's adding a JavaScript bundle, another JavaScript bundle, another one, and then a CSS bundle at the end. So it's basically the same bundles I had before, but it's just using a different library to do it. Okay, so now I've got that code in there. It's going to copy to the output directory, so it'll be available during compilation to be made into a bundle. And I've gone ahead and configured LigerShark to create these. The last thing to do is to add it to the pipeline. And so here in the program CS, right under static files, I'm just going to do app.useWebOptimizer. So that's the extension method that LigerShark adds to the app class there. And that's going to add LigerShark to the pipeline. So when it sees a bundle, it's going to know how to handle it. You'll notice that I put it after static files. That's because at some point, I might actually start moving these over into static files. And if they exist as a static file, I want them to respond from that file first, and then for it to go to LigerShark. So let's go ahead and run this now and see if we have fixed our problem. All right, so rebuild and relaunch this. And when this pops up, we're on our modern app. I'm going to go ahead and just go right to System.Web. And we can see that it's working just the way it was before. Now, theoretically, all of that stuff is coming from the modern application. The CSS and JavaScript and such is coming from the modern application. How do we know that's true? Well, maybe the best way to do that is if I go back to the modern app, to the legacy app, and if I go to the code here, where it actually calls my bundle config and comment this out, now we rerun this. Now it wouldn't work anymore if it was forwarding it to the legacy application. So let's see what happens here. So this first page that comes up will be the home page, the default route that hasn't been migrated yet. And then if we go to System.Web, you can see that the CSS is still working in both those places. So I've now completed moving my JavaScript and CSS bundles with LigerShark and with YARP, forwarding it to the old ones first, now using it from the modern app. All right. So I wanted to at least mention System.Web adapters. We don't have a lot of time to look at these, but I want to mention them because they're very important. You saw me actually use them there in my class library to make my System.Web call to HTTP context to get the user agent to actually work. If you're doing a real migration, you're probably going to have some things like session state, or you're going to be using maybe authentication cookies or something like that from your legacy application. All of that functionality is available in the System.Web adapters. If it's something from System.Web namespace, I would say 80% of that, all of the stuff that's most commonly used, has been moved over. All of the APIs look exactly the same as they did when they were in System.Web. Just like you saw in my code, I didn't have to rewrite a line of code in there. It just retargeted to a different NuGet package under the covers. You might not even notice that you're not referencing System.Web. There's other things, though, that are a little more complicated. If you're using session state and you want that to be shared between the two applications. If you're using authentication and you want that to be shared between the two applications. There's actually 3 different System.Web adapters NuGet packages. There's the general one, which is the one we were just using now. There's the core services, and there's the framework services. I think those names make it pretty obvious what they do, but the core services one is if you want to do anything like session state synchronization or sharing authentication between the two applications, the core services NuGet package goes into your modern core application, and the framework services goes into your framework application. A little bit of configuration for how that data gets shared between those two. There's a bunch of different ways that that data can be shared. It could be all hosted on one, and the other one is always calling the other one over a certain port to get that data, or they can be stored in a database to be accessed. There's a bunch of different ways you can set that up. But this is the NuGet package or packages that you're going to want to use if you're wanting to do that. So where is YARP at right now? Well, YARP is on version 2.1 most recently. The System.Web adapters are on version 1.3. So these are fairly long in the tooth products that you can use in production. As you noticed when we used the .NET Upgrade Assistant, that is still in preview. And so it's not perfect. And it probably never will be perfect because web applications are complicated. I think it's at the point now where I would recommend using it if you're doing a migration. You might use it at the beginning and then use it less as you go. But I think it's a great way to get things bootstrapped at the beginning of the process. And it is only getting better every day. You can go to these links here if you want to know more about any of those projects. I want to just remind you that the GitHub link here will have all of the stuff that we just looked at. You can feel free to contact me, come up and chat afterwards, or sign up for a free consultation. If that would be of value to you, feel free to do this. And with our couple minutes left, any questions? We've got a microphone in the back here. If you just raise your hand.
You mentioned overhead early on. You were talking about just having a legacy app with YARP in front of it. Do you know how much of a slowdown that is, or does YARP add lifecycle hooks to measure that, and so we can be aware of how much they can down?
Great question. Yeah, how much of a slowdown is YARP to be there? And the answer is it depends, right? Always a good engineering answer. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. It depends on how fast the hardware is, how close the two systems are to each other, how fast the backplane is that they're communicating over. It's going to add a few milliseconds to 10 or 20 milliseconds at the worst in your typical case. Now, obviously, if you put that in your core application and that core application gets extremely busy and the hardware it's on is not capable of handling that, that's going to create a bottleneck for the legacy calls as well. So it's just something to be aware of. Some people will actually use YARP and separate it out into a separate application and forward things from that layer just so that they have more fine-grained control over tuning performance like that. Yeah, great question though. Other questions? Yeah, one right here.
Hey, good talk.
Thank you.
So recently I've just done an upgrade, and one of the traps I found was that with the session state that the defaults are set for the cookies. So you actually have to turn them on so you can actually use them, where in .NET framework, that wasn't the case. So that's just the trap that you're going to be aware of here.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're going to be doing any of that session state or authentication sharing, you're going to want to read the documentation pretty carefully because there are definitely some gotchas in there. The way .NET Core works and the way .NET Framework works by default, .NET Core is a lot more secure. And so there's some things that are kind of turned off by default that you might need to turn back on. Yeah, great point. All right, one more. If there's any more, we'll take one more. All right, right here.
So you sort of touched on this briefly, but is there any good solution for migrating web forms apps, or do you just give up and quit?
That's right. How close are you to retirement, right? No, there are not a lot of great options for web forms developers, but there are new technologies that are more similar to that. The one that Microsoft is pushing, and I think for very good reason, is Blazor, which I'm sure you've heard of. You probably have seen some of the talks the last few days about that here. The thing that's nice about that is it's C# front to back. And so if you are a web forms developer, that's going to be a programming model that you're going to be more comfortable with. However, it's a totally different programming model. You do still need to learn HTML and CSS better than you probably would as a web forms developer. But there is no straight migration. There are some third-party tools out there that try to make it easier. But from what I've seen, the best option is probably to rewrite those things gradually in something more modern. Because even if you use a third party that kind of makes web forms work on .NET Core, you still have to maintain that. And now what happens if that third party goes away? When the demand goes down for that, now you're just stuck doing the migration anyway. So that's kind of what I'm advising people to. It's a little bit of bad news. I'm sorry.
No worries.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.